I used to think the worst sound in the world was twisting metal. I was wrong. The worst sound is people you love laughing while your heart quietly breaks. If someone had met me a year before that Christmas, they would have seen someone who rarely sat still. My name is Claire, and I loved being busy. I worked as a graphic designer for a small agency outside Chicago, spent weekends wandering farmers markets with coffee in one hand, and had a habit of starting craft projects I probably didn't have time to finish. My parents used to tease me about it. "You never learned how to relax," my mom would say. And thank goodness, my dad would laugh. Otherwise we'd never get homemade birthday cards again. For a long time, I believed those moments were real. Maybe they were. Or maybe love is easier to give when life is uncomplicated. The accident happened on an ordinary Thursday evening in June. It had rained most of the afternoon, and the roads were still slick when I left work. I called my mom while I drove, because she wanted to know whether I'd be coming over that weekend. "We're grilling Saturday," she said. "I'll be there." "You always say that." "I mean it this time." She laughed. "Drive safely." "I always do." Those were the last normal words either of us ever said to each other. The traffic light turned green. I eased into the intersection. Then headlights filled my windshield. I remember trying to turn the steering wheel. I remember a deafening crash. After that, everything became noise, pain, and darkness. When I woke up, I thought I'd been asleep for an hour. It had been almost 3 days. The first thing I noticed was the smell of antiseptic. The second was that I couldn't feel my legs. I tried anyway. Nothing. I stared at the blanket covering them. "Can you move your toes?" the doctor asked gently. I kept trying. Nothing happened. He pulled up a chair. Doctors have a certain expression when they know they're about to change someone's life forever. I saw it before he spoke. The drunk driver had survived. He'd crossed the center line after leaving a bar. My spine had taken the worst of the impact. There had been multiple surgeries. The swelling had stabilized. But the damage was permanent. I heard every word. I just couldn't accept any of them. For weeks I convinced myself they had to be wrong. I'd wiggle a toe tomorrow. I'd stand next month. I'd walk before Christmas. Reality doesn't negotiate. Rehabilitation became my full-time job. Learning to transfer from a bed into a wheelchair. Learning how to shower differently. Learning how to reach things from a seated position. Learning that independence sometimes means accepting help without feeling ashamed. Some days I was hopeful. Some days I cried after physical therapy, because my body refused to do what my mind remembered. A therapist once told me, "Your life isn't over, it's different." I nodded, because I knew she was trying to help. I didn't believe her. Not yet. My friends visited constantly. Co-workers organized meal deliveries. Neighbors installed a small ramp outside my apartment, before I even asked. People I barely knew somehow found ways to make my life easier. My parents visited too. At first, Dad never stayed long. He always had somewhere else to be. Mom fussed over my blankets and asked if I needed anything, but our conversations became strangely shallow. Neither of them ever asked how terrified I was. Neither of them ever asked what losing the use of my legs actually felt like. Instead, they kept saying things like, "Stay positive." As if positivity could repair a spinal cord. When I finally returned home, I decided I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life waiting for things to go back to normal. There wasn't going to be a normal anymore. There was only whatever came next. So I adapted. I rearranged my apartment. I returned to work remotely. I figured out new routines. Life became slower, harder, but it was still mine. The only place where I never felt completely comfortable again was around my parents. Little things started changing. Dad stopped inviting me on family outings. "It's probably too much trouble." He never asked if I wanted to go anyway. Mom started speaking to me in that careful voice people use around someone they think is fragile. Whenever relatives visited, conversations would stop for a second when I rolled into the room. Then everyone suddenly acted overly cheerful. It wasn't kindness. It was discomfort. One afternoon, I overheard my father talking to one of his friends outside. It's just hard seeing her like that. I waited for him to say something about how proud he was that I kept fighting. Instead, he sighed. Nothing's been the same. I quietly turned my wheelchair around before he realized I'd heard him. That hurt more than I admitted. Still, when Christmas approached, I let myself hope. Maybe the holidays would remind everyone that we were still a family. Money had become tight because of medical bills, so instead of buying gifts, I made them. That felt more meaningful anyway. I spent evenings painting ornaments, knitting scarves, restoring an old pocket knife that had belonged to my grandfather for my dad. I even wrote each family member a handwritten letter about my favorite memory with them. It took weeks. My hands cramped. Sometimes supplies fell onto the floor, and picking them up became its own little challenge. I laughed through most of it, because every finished gift felt like another reason to believe things could still be okay. A few days before Christmas, Mom called. "We're expecting everyone Christmas morning." "I'll be there." "You don't have to bring presents. I already finished them." There was a pause. "I'm sure people will appreciate them." Her voice sounded strange. Flat. I ignored it. Christmas morning arrived bright and cold. Snow covered the neighborhood. The kind that makes everything look peaceful, even when it isn't. Loading my wheelchair, gifts, and overnight bag into my adapted SUV took almost 40 minutes. By the time I reached my parents' house, relatives had already arrived. Children ran through the front yard throwing snowballs. Christmas music drifted through the windows. I smiled. For the first time in months, I actually felt excited. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey. The tree sparkled. Wrapping paper already littered the floor around excited little cousins. "Merry Christmas," I said. Several relatives smiled. A few hugged me. Others complimented the gift bags balanced across my lap. I spotted my parents near the fireplace. Mom smiled politely. Dad barely looked at me. "I made something for everyone," I said. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward me. For a split second, I thought he was finally going to hug me. Instead, he stepped behind my wheelchair. His hands gripped the handles. Without asking, he pushed. The chair rolled into the middle of the living room. Conversations faded. Everyone looked up. "Dad?" He kept pushing until every eye in the room was fixed on us. Then he walked around and stood directly in front of me. His face was completely expressionless. "If you really want to be part of this family." He paused. "Crawl?" Silence. One heartbeat. Then laughter. Not nervous laughter. Real laughter. Someone actually slapped their knee. A cousin looked away. An aunt covered her mouth but didn't say a word. I searched every face in that room. Nobody moved. Nobody told him he'd gone too far. I turned toward my mother. She didn't defend me. She quietly walked behind my chair, unlocked the brakes, turned it around, then calmly pushed my wheelchair through the kitchen and into the garage. She came back alone. I stared after her. I couldn't believe what I'd just watched. My own mother had removed the one thing that gave me independence. Without saying a single word, Dad folded his arms. "Well?" The room stayed silent. I looked down at the gifts in my lap. Weeks of work. Weeks of hope. In that moment, I realized I hadn't misunderstood my family. I'd simply spent 6 months refusing to believe they could really see me this way. Oddly enough, I didn't feel angry. Not at first. I felt clear. Like a fog had finally lifted. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, scrolled to one contact, pressed call. The line rang once. "Hello? It's me." "I know." I glanced around the room. Every person who had laughed suddenly seemed very interested in pretending nothing unusual had happened. "It's time," I said quietly. There was a brief pause. Then the voice asked, "Are you sure?" I looked toward the garage where my wheelchair had disappeared. Then at my father. Finally, at my mother. "Yes. I'm sure. I'll see you soon." The call ended. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Dad smiled as though he'd won some invisible battle. Someone turned the Christmas music back on. People awkwardly resumed talking. No one apologized. No one helped me. No one even asked whether I was okay. I simply waited. Exactly 20 minutes later, 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed through the house. Every conversation stopped. My father's smile faded as he turned toward the front door. He reached for the handle and opened it. He froze. The color drained from his face so quickly that even from where I sat, I noticed it. Standing on the porch were 2 uniformed police officers. Beside them was a woman in a navy blazer, holding a leather folder against her chest. The older officer spoke first. "Good morning. We're looking for Claire." Every conversation inside the house stopped. My father glanced over his shoulder at me before forcing a smile. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't," the officer replied evenly. "May we come in?" Dad stepped aside without another word. The 3 of them entered slowly, taking in the room. The overturned wrapping paper, the untouched gifts still sitting across my lap, the expressions on everyone's faces. Then the woman in the blazer looked directly at me. "Claire?" "Yes." She walked over and crouched so we were eye level. "I'm Rebecca Lawson with Adult Protective Services." A few relatives exchanged confused looks. She continued quietly. "You called requesting immediate assistance because you believed you were being subjected to abuse and unlawful interference with your mobility device." The room went completely silent. Dad found his voice first. "Oh, come on, it was a joke." Neither officer laughed. Rebecca looked toward the garage. "Where is her wheelchair?" Nobody answered. She asked again. "Where is Ms. Bennett's wheelchair?" My mother swallowed. I put it in the garage." "Why?" Mom opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Rebecca stood. "I'd like the wheelchair brought back immediately." Dad folded his arms. "This is ridiculous." One of the officers turned toward him. "Sir, refusing to return a person's mobility equipment after intentionally separating them from it can become a very serious matter depending on the circumstances." It was Christmas. It was a joke. It lasted less than 5 minutes. I spoke before either officer could answer. It had been 23 minutes. Everyone looked at me. I checked. My voice stayed calm. I couldn't leave. I couldn't reach my vehicle. I couldn't even use the restroom without crawling across your floor. The words settled over the room like heavy snow. Rebecca didn't raise her voice. "Please bring the wheelchair back." My mother hurried toward the garage. She returned a minute later, pushing it awkwardly. When she stopped beside me, she whispered, "Claire." I looked at her. She couldn't meet my eyes. One of the officers helped lock the brakes while Rebecca waited until I transferred safely back into my chair. The simple act of sitting where I belonged nearly made me cry. Not because I was emotional, because I'd forgotten how vulnerable I'd been only moments before. Rebecca turned toward my parents. "I'd like to understand exactly what happened today." Dad laughed again, but there was panic underneath it now. "My daughter is being dramatic." One of my cousins finally spoke. "No." Every head turned toward him. He looked nervous. It wasn't really a joke." His wife nodded. "He actually told her to crawl." An aunt quietly added, "Everyone heard it." Another relative looked ashamed. "I should have said something." The silence cracked. Then, everything came pouring out. People admitted what they'd seen, what they'd heard, how uncomfortable they'd felt, how nobody knew what to do. Rebecca listened without interrupting. Finally she looked back at my father. "Did you tell your daughter to crawl if she wanted to be accepted by her family?" He hesitated. "That's not exactly... Yes or no?" "Yes." "And your wife removed her wheelchair?" He looked at Mom. She lowered her head. "Yes." Rebecca closed her folder. "I appreciate your honesty." Dad looked relieved for exactly 1 second. Then she continued. "Unfortunately, you've just confirmed the essential facts." His face fell. "What facts?" That your adult daughter, who permanently relies on a mobility device, was intentionally deprived of that device while being publicly humiliated. Dad shook his head. You're twisting this? No, sir. You admitted it. One of the officers spoke next. Nobody's placing anyone under arrest today. Dad exhaled. But, the officer continued, this incident will be documented. Rebecca looked at me. Claire, would you like assistance collecting your belongings? I would. That sentence hit harder than I expected, because somewhere inside me, I'd still imagined an apology. A hug. Something. Instead, I realized I simply wanted to leave. My younger cousin quietly helped gather my gift bags. I'm sorry, she whispered. You didn't do anything. I laughed. I looked at her for a long moment. So did everyone else. She started crying. That wasn't the reaction I wanted. I wasn't looking for guilt. I just wanted honesty. As we reached the front door, Dad finally spoke. So that's it? I turned my chair around. What do you mean? You're really calling the authorities on your own family over one bad joke? I almost laughed. One joke? I looked around the room. No. This wasn't about one joke. It was 6 months of pretending I embarrassed you. It was every invitation that suddenly disappeared. It was every conversation where my disability became something you spoke about instead of speaking to me. It was treating me like I'd become less of a daughter because I couldn't walk. His jaw tightened. We sacrificed a lot too. I know you did. I never denied that. But I lost the use of my legs. You lost the version of me that made you comfortable. Those weren't the same loss. He had no answer. My mother suddenly burst into tears. I'm sorry. It came out so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I'm so sorry. I believed she meant it. That was the hardest part. Because regret doesn't erase choices. She walked toward me carefully. I should have stopped him. Yes. I was scared. I know. I kept thinking if I just stayed quiet. I finished the sentence for her. It would be over faster. She nodded while crying. I reached out and squeezed her hand. I love you. She sobbed harder. But I can't keep pretending this didn't happen. She understood. I could see it. For the first time in months, she actually looked at me, instead of looking away from the wheelchair. Rebecca waited patiently by the door. There was nothing else to say. As I rolled outside, snowflakes drifted through the cold air. The police officers helped load my gifts into my SUV. I almost left them behind. Then I realized something. Those gifts represented who I was. Kind, creative, hopeful. Their cruelty didn't change that. A week later, I received several phone calls. Some relatives apologized. Some tried to explain why they hadn't spoken up. A few insisted I'd overreacted. Those conversations became surprisingly simple. If someone spent more time defending what happened than acknowledging how wrong it was, I ended the call. Life became quieter after Christmas. Lonelier too, but peaceful. For the first time since my accident, I stopped chasing the approval of people who had already decided I wasn't enough. A month later, my mother asked if we could meet for coffee. Just the two of us. She looked older. Tired. I've started therapy, she admitted. I smiled gently. I'm glad. I spent months convincing myself that keeping peace meant staying silent. She looked down at her coffee. I finally realized silence always chooses a side. That sentence stayed with me. We didn't magically repair everything that afternoon. Healing isn't that simple. Trust certainly isn't. But it was the first honest conversation we'd had in a long time. My father never apologized. He sent messages. Short ones. Mostly saying everyone had misunderstood his humor. Eventually, the messages stopped. I never blocked him. I just stopped waiting for him to become someone he wasn't willing to be. The following Christmas looked very different. I decorated my apartment, invited friends, neighbors, my physical therapist, the barista, who always remembered my order. People who had shown me kindness without asking for anything in return. We laughed, played board games, burned the cookies, ordered pizza instead. It wasn't perfect. It was real. At one point, I looked around the room and realized something. Family isn't always the people who share your last name. Sometimes it's the people who would never ask you to crawl just to make themselves feel taller. That Christmas gave me something my accident never could. Clarity. The drunk driver took my ability to walk. My father almost took my sense of worth. Only one of them succeeded temporarily. The other never got to keep it. Because I finally understood that dignity isn't something another person can take away, unless you hand it to them. And the day I rolled out of that house, I took mine with me. A few months later, spring finally arrived. The snow melted. The trees outside my apartment turned green again. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became quieter in the best possible way. I found myself saying yes to things I would have turned down before. I joined an adaptive art class. I started volunteering once a week with a local support group for people adjusting to life after spinal cord injuries. The first time someone newly injured looked at me and said, "I don't think I'll ever feel normal again," I recognized the fear in their eyes, because I'd seen it in my own reflection. I didn't tell them everything would be okay. Instead, I told them the truth. It won't be the life you planned, but it can still become a life you're proud of. For the first time since the accident, those words felt real. My relationship with my mother remained careful, built one honest conversation at a time. We still had a long road ahead of us, but now it was paved with truth instead of silence. As for my father, I stopped measuring my healing by whether he ever understood what he had done. Some answers never come, and some apologies never arrive. Waiting for them only gives the past more power than it deserves. One afternoon, I found one of the handmade ornaments I'd almost left behind that Christmas. I hung it in my kitchen window where the sunlight caught the tiny brushstrokes I'd painted months before. It made me smile, not because it reminded me of what I'd lost, but because it reminded me of who I had been all along. The accident changed my body. My family changed my heart. But neither of them got to decide the rest of my story. That choice was always mine. And the day I stopped begging to be accepted by people who refused to see my worth, was the day I finally learned that walking was never what carried me forward. Courage did.